Hello, I'm Rebecca Wood and I'm a senior lecturer in inclusive education at the University of Glasgow. And today I'm going to be talking about research and disability. So I will start by covering a few definitions and meanings of disability. Then I'll be talking a little bit about theory, particularly models of disability. I'll be discussing participatory approaches. I'll touch very briefly on use of language. And then I will give some worked examples from my own research. Overall, my aim is to try and suggest how we should all consider ourselves to be researchers in disability so that we can conduct more inclusive research. So we all have lots of different ideas about disability depending on our own personal experiences and circumstances. First of all, we do tend to assume that disability is physical. Disability can often convey ideas of neediness. I've got a picture there of a collection box that used to be very prevalent around the UK in shops. But equally, you also have the sort of you can do anything trope in exceptional circumstances. I've got a picture there of Chris McCausland who won Strictly as a blind person. Of course, this is an incredible achievement and he was rightly greatly lauded for it. But equally, there were lots of messages circulating about how you can sort of overcome disability if you really try, and I think this was less useful. Other associations, such as being trapped or alone, we don't tend to have images of sociality in relation to disability, and rather like Chris McCausland, famous people are often associated with the notion of transcending disability. The World Health Organization defines disability according to 3 dimensions. So the first dimension is impairment in a person's body structure or function or mental functioning. The second dimension is activity limitation, such as difficulty seeing, hearing, walking, or problem solving. And thirdly, participation restrictions in normal daily activities, such as working, engaging in social and recreational activities, and obtaining healthcare and preventative services. We also have, in the UK, we have the Equality Act from 2010, and according to the Act, you are disabled if you have a mental or physical impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. So substantial means it's more than minor or trivial, and long-term means 12 months or more. Now, these definitions, although they may be helpful to a certain extent, and certainly they can enable individuals to express their rights in terms of support, they don't obviously provide us with all the information we need to develop our understanding of disability. They don't incorporate the complex attitudes we all have towards disability. And certainly they don't explore sufficiently how disability is experienced or how it can be experienced, particularly in relation to stigma, exclusion, prejudice, and othering. According to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, persons with disabilities are disproportionately affected by poverty and overrepresented among the poorest in the world. And of course, disability often intersects with other characteristics such as poverty, ethnicity, and gender. For GRU, the word disability is polysemic, with multiple possible shades of meaning, but it always refers, according to GRU, to a lack or limitation in some capacity of the body, be it mental or physical. We also have issues around structural exclusion. One of the problems with these definitions is it suggests a kind of in or an out camp. The idea that people are either disabled or not. This is a sort of fixed state that rests within the individual. In addition, media narratives can often perpetuate anxiety and fear and otherness. At the moment, there's a lot in the media about the experience of children with special educational needs and disabilities. For example, Woman's Hour did a big feature on it. It's often in The Independent and other mainstream news outlets. But what's important is these media outlets don't tend to consider disability as part of their usual coverage. So Women's Hour will often discuss access to childcare, but it won't incorporate the experiences of parents of disabled children, or indeed disabled parents, in relation to those issues. They will only talk about that separately. Issues around the curriculum, they won't incorporate the needs of children with additional support needs, for example. That is always discussed separately. Similarly, the war in Gaza, there is not enough discussion of the impact on people with disabilities, and indeed how the war itself is generating a great deal of a disability. There are also issues of sensationalism and finding stories to fit a narrative decided in advance. So even when there's a lot of coverage of disability issues, it's debatable as to how helpful this is. Similar attitudes pervade the research field. It's considered that there are disability researchers, that disability research is for others. It doesn't concern me. Unfortunately, even within the disability research context, there can be exclusion, particularly individuals with learning difficulties. Nind wrote in 2008, people with learning communication difficulties have something to say that is worth hearing and experiences that are worth understanding. People with learning difficulties in journal articles, for example, are often relegated to the limitations section, thus absolving the researcher of responsibility and providing permission to exclude all over again. There can be much trumpeting sometimes of participatory methods, but it needs to be acknowledged that participatory methods can only be participatory for some. So there's a need for greater cogency and transparency about this. And so all of these issues can contribute to and perpetuate the marginalisation of disabled people. So if we want to make sense of disability, particularly if you are new to this area or thinking about this for the first time, it might be useful to align three possible positionalities. And these are very broad brushstroke and simplified. The reality is more complicated than that, but this might be useful. So the first positionality is to perceive disability as being situated within the person. That disability is essentially a medical condition that the person holds within them. Another positionality is that you might see disability and disablement resulting from a lack of support, a lack of accommodations, a lack of understanding, etc. And therefore disability is situated externally. Or indeed you might see disability as being a combination of the two, that some fundamental impairment intersects with societal limitations, lack of support, etc., resulting in disablement or an increase in disablement. And so disability and how we understand it is obviously more complicated than these three positionalities, but I think it's a useful conceptualization to help navigate our understanding of disability and disability research. I also think that models of disability provide a very useful lens to aid our understanding of disability. So the medical model of disability could be aligned with the idea that disability sits within the person. Social model of disability is more inclined to see disability as operating at societal level, externally to the individual, being generated externally. And then you have biopsychosocial and interaction models where disability is conceived as occurring through intersecting within person circumstances and external ones. There are, in fact, in the literature many other models and many also overlap. McCall et al. Identified 5 models, Ryu and Valentine 4 overall models with further subdivisions. Zaks in 2022 delineated other more recent models such as the welfare, well-being model of disability, human rights, affirmative, dialectical. And each of these models has implications for how we understand and research disability. Just to comment on a style note, a model cannot see, think, act, say or argue. Write instead something like from the perspective of the social model of disability, or something similar. So the medical model of disability is sometimes known as the individual model. According to Wu and Valentine, the medical model can be subdivided into the biomedical approach and the functional approach, but they write both are based on individual pathology and lead to a drive to either eliminate or cure the disability, or ameliorate the condition and provide comfort to the individual. The medical model of disability is the main route to support. It's very difficult to access support if issues and difficulties are not identified as sitting within the person. The medical model of disability is very dominant in the education system, such as in the Children and Families Act 2014. And importantly, particularly within the education sector, the medical model of disability is linked to the interventionist model, the drive to repair and remediate the difficulties. It's also linked to the charity model, such as we see in Children in Need. The medical model has undergone many critiques. According to Hughes, through the medical model of disability, disability is conceived of as a spoiled identity, an undesirable state to overcome. For Hurst, the medical model of disability carries within it an inherent disableism, with normality as the yardstick against which disabled people are measured and found to be lacking. For McCall et al., obtaining support means the necessity of adopting the sick role and becoming a patient, rather than a citizen with full rights and participation. And Davis et al. Said that there has been a medicalization of childhood itself, meaning that children who do not achieve universal standardized developmental targets are pathologized. And actually, I think we see this increasingly, particularly in relation to behavior in schools. According to Terzi, the medical model of disability in education environments results in perspectives emphasizing individual limitations, which end up overshadowing the role played by the design of schooling institutions in determining learning difficulties. And interestingly, Zaks in 2022 proposes renaming the medical model of disability as the normalization model to avoid conflation with useful medical care. So we also have the social model of disability. It can often be framed as the opposite of the medical model of disability, but this kind of positioning fails to reflect the nuance that's needed. So according to the social model of disability, disablement results from a lack of support, a lack of accommodations, attitudinal barriers, stigma. According to Devlin and Pothier, according to the social model of disability, disability is a social construct. It has no essential nature, but rather specific personal characteristics are understood as defects, and as a result, persons are manufactured as disabled. For Liazidou, the idea of inclusive education itself is founded on the social model of disability, as it refers to the restructuring of social and, by implication, educational settings in order to meet the needs of all learners, irrespective of their diverse biographical, developmental, and learning trajectories. And for Joukowsky, the social model of disability is innately enabling, allowing disabled people to challenge oppressive research methods and policies that do not include their perspectives and experiences. And really interestingly, Pfeiffer wrote in the year 2000, disability is actually on a continuum, which potentially includes everyone across the lifespan. We all will experience disability to a greater or lesser extent as we grow older in particular, or if we fall ill. So again, if you think about this idea of the in-out camp and how not very useful that idea is. The social model of disability has undergone critiques. So according to Burry, the social model has not really engaged with the real issues facing the vast majority of disabled people. For Lindsay, the social model plays down or actively ignores both the within-child factors and the issue of interaction. For Alan, The failure of the social model to acknowledge the reality of impairment can mean a denial of the disabled body itself. And interestingly, Davis et al. Wrote that the social model homogenizes people and does not incorporate an understanding that disabled children might be capable of affecting the structures surrounding their lives. So it's really important not to negate the agency of disabled individuals and disabled children. This is something that they don't need to be given, but something that they are claiming for themselves. So interactional models are becoming increasingly prevalent in medical circles, particularly the biopsychosocial model. The World Health Organization in 2024 wrote that disability results from the interaction between individuals with a health condition with personal and environmental factors, including negative attitudes, inaccessible transportation and public buildings, and limited social support. A person's environment has a huge effect on the experience and extent of disability. So here there's a recognition of personal characteristics, i.e. impairment, as well as the multiple factors that intersect with these. Shakespeare wrote that disability is a complex interaction of biological, psychological, cultural and sociological factors which cannot be extricated except with precision. So the different models of disability can help to frame all stages of a research project and provide a lens through which we understand what we're doing. Firstly, we should always assume that disabled people are taking part in research, whether or not we are actively conducting research in the disability field, bearing in mind that not all disabilities are visible and not everybody feels able to be open about being disabled, often due to stigma. In principle, participants should not need to be open about a disability to be able to participate. A lot of individuals these days, if they're conducting research in the disability field, will often have an advisory committee, particularly if that researcher is not disabled themselves. But this also needs thinking about. Are the members of that committee anonymous or not? i.e., do they want their work and their suggestions and their contribution to be recognised? If there are going to be journal articles coming from this research or a book, are they co-authors? Importantly, are they paid? Who is providing consent in your study? Have you considered the role of gatekeepers? How are your participants compensated? Who benefits from your research? Be modest in your claims. It's likely to be only you, particularly in a sole researcher study like a master's degree or a PhD. So don't assume that being involved is compensation enough. So if you're conducting research in the disability field, you need to consider all of these issues. Now, participatory approaches are often considered a way of facilitating research with disabled people. The first question to ask is, are you conducting research on, about, for, or with disabled people? Who is setting the research priorities and the agenda? And of course, disabled people are increasingly leading research and setting research priorities themselves, which is only as it should be. As part of your daily life, how much do you engage with marginalised communities? Because if you don't, it's going to be quite difficult for you to suddenly engage with them as part of your research. Think about where the power lies. Again, who is being paid? Whose career stands to benefit? Think carefully also about the concept of giving voice to. Is it yours to give? This phrasing is redolent of the charity model, and it's also inherently exclusionary of participants who are minimally and non-speaking. Have you thought about how they may be included in your research? Be aware of the limitations of convenient sampling. Obviously, research has to be manageable, particularly for a sole researcher. But if you only conduct research in your front garden, you're only going to find out about your front garden. Who is interpreting your results? How are you disseminating your results and to whom? So all of these principles are not necessarily easy, and in fact they can be particularly difficult to achieve in sole researcher studies. But it certainly is important to think about them and to address them to the extent that you can. Be careful also about describing your research as emancipatory. particularly in the disability field. To be emancipatory, participants have to have significant input into the whole research process and be empowered through it. Thinking about how accessible your methods may be. For example, are participants able to take breaks? Is the timing of their choosing? Have you thought about physical access, communication support? Are people allowed to use support assistance? If not, why not? Even sensitivity of questions. If your questions are too blunt, that in itself can be quite exclusionary. If they're not thoughtful, if you're not thinking about the whole shape of an interview, for example. What font are you using? Are you using a sans font or something more fun? Now that might be fine for children, for example, but equally it could create issues of access. Think about the size of your font. Is it legible? Line spacing, use of visuals. What format are you using? Online or paper-based? So all of this needs thinking about whether or not you are, whether or not your objective is to conduct research in the disability field. The aim, of course, should be for all research methods to be accessible as much as you can. Now, I'm just going to touch briefly on use of language. There are many debates in the disability research and practice fields about language and terminology, and there are some strong opinions on this, and not necessarily everybody agrees. But researchers do have a responsibility to fully engage with those debates and respect the language choices of their participants. There are issues around, for example, person first or identity first language. So in the autism context, although it's not universally agreed, it's generally considered that identity first language is preferable. Autistic child, autistic adult, as opposed to child with autism, for example. And the idea behind that is that it shouldn't be suggested that it's somehow desirable or even possible to separate the autism from the individual. With Down syndrome, it tends to be person first, e.g. adult with Down syndrome. Some disabled communities use capital letters, such as the deaf community, to underscore the fact that it is a kind of specific culture and language. And people in education and social care sectors often unwittingly use stigmatizing language without even realizing it. And this particularly applies to a kind of essentialism that can be applied to individuals. So SEN child. If you think about all of the adjectives that you could apply to a child, happy, sporty, intelligent, SEN child is incredibly reductive. Severely autistic, what does that even mean? The disabled, the term able-bodied. These are all very othering terminology, and they really do have an effect. They both generate and contribute to exclusion, as Gru said earlier on. And in my view, it's better to use the term child participation rather than child voice, because it incorporates individuals who may not use speech as a primary means of communication. So I'm now going to give an example from my PhD. I've chosen this because in my PhD study I had autistic children and autistic adults who were participants, whereas since then my research has focused on autistic adults predominantly. So this was a case study in 5 mainstream primary schools, and I was looking at the inclusion in the curriculum and assessment of autistic children. So my participants were 10 autistic children and 10 autistic adults. There were also 36 school staff and 10 parents, but I won't be discussing that aspect of my study today. So the first step that I had to take, and anybody has to take, is of course ethics. Now ethics committees will set a high bar for the inclusion of children firstly, and secondly particularly children with disabilities. They are deemed to be particularly vulnerable. Now, while of course it's very important to conduct research which is entirely safe for children to participate in, nevertheless framing certain individuals as vulnerable can lead to their exclusion from research. And so I think it's very important to sort of tackle this head on in ethics applications and be really clear about this idea of vulnerability and explain it in your application. So, for example, I included a comment about the children who I was going to spend quite a lot of time with in the schools becoming attached. I didn't want to be one of those individuals that kind of float into their lives and then disappear again. Well, the ethics committee were very concerned about that, and so I had to provide quite a lot of explanation about how I was going to avoid any issues around that. For the adults, there are always ethical issues in relation to asking them to share a diagnosis, so that will move your research into a high risk category often. So therefore, if you want to be inclusive of disabled people in your study, you need to be prepared to conduct a detailed ethics application and really avoid box ticking. I always think with ethics, although it's quite hard work completing ethics applications, sincerity is really important. If you genuinely care, it will actually help you to complete those forms. So the second step is recruitment. Now, recruiting child participants, the autistic children, meant navigating several gatekeepers. First of all, I got permission from the local authority, which was relatively easy for me because I was already familiar with some of the people who worked in that local authority. Then I had to have permission from the individual head teachers of the schools, and I had 5 in total. Then individual staff members, whether or not they were participants. Sometimes if a child was in the class of a teacher who wasn't a participant, I still obviously had to get permission from that teacher about when I could work with the child. Also, admin staff. It can actually be very hard to get past the school office. Schools these days have understandably quite high levels of security, and you can end up spending a lot of time standing at the intercom explaining that yes, you did arrange in advance to come into the school, and that can be, quite hard work. So getting past the school office can be quite a barrier in itself. And obviously for child participants, you have to have parental consent. In my study, there were sometimes literal barriers. There was an occasion when I was locked into the school car park, in fact, more than once, because staff members would have passes. I didn't have that, and I was, again, pressing buzzers and trying to get people's attention. And there was one occasion when I thought I was actually going to have to scale the fence just to try and flag somebody down and let me out of the car park. As well as informed consent from the parents, I provided assent, obtained consent from the children. This is just good practice. It has no legal basis, and therefore obviously it needs to be accessible, such as an easy read version. And what was helpful to me in the recruitment of the autistic adults who took part in my study were the connections I'd already formed with autistic-led organisations. This was not at all my motivation. It was just something that I had done as an early stage of my research, and which was incredibly helpful and insightful for me. So be prepared to navigate a range of gatekeepers. Arguably, participant consent and assent is the most important aspect. Connections with disability-led organisations can be very beneficial, although I just really want to underscore the fact that I'm not at all suggesting this should be your primary motivation. But if you're conducting research in the disability context, you really should be making connections with disability-led organisations. Now, I think this is incredibly important in all areas of research, certainly qualitative research. So I had an initial familiarisation period with the children. I wanted to get to know them, for them to become relaxed in my presence. So I wasn't collecting any data during that time. And it enabled me to gain an understanding of their communication preferences, what their interests were. I took books in with me and sort of sensory items. It was a very pleasant and enjoyable time. It enabled me to fine-tune my methods, and in fact, with regard to a couple of children, I had to return to ethics because I realised that they needed a method that I hadn't accounted for. So again, this is something you need to kind of be prepared to do. And so I had different methods, usually more than one for each child. And with the adults too, I tried to give them as much flexibility as possible in terms of how they took part in the research, and I also had different methods of recruitment for them as well. So in fact, in the end, each autistic child and adult had a bespoke approach that was developed before I even started collecting the data. So flexible approaches support inclusion in research. So then the data collection itself. So for me, the time, location, and the nature of the data collection was different for each child. For example, one child liked to have a friend with them. Bear in mind as well with children that it's not always their choice. Sometimes the teacher will say, oh, it has to be in a break time. And this was a little bit problematic. Certainly there was one child in my study who was sent off to do an interview with me in his break time, and he was sort of looking longingly outside at the children running around. And I asked him if he wanted to go outside and play, and he did, and so I abandoned the interview. So you have to have a high degree of flexibility, but bear in mind you still have to follow what the adults are saying is needed. Be very aware also that children in particular can answer questions in an alternative way. One thing that I became very conscious of was that I had written my kind of interview questions or my questionnaires or whatever they were from a kind of entirely adult perspective. But actually children have different perspectives, they have different priorities, and so you have to be alive to that. As much as I could, I tried to empower the children. I let them have a go at the camcorder. They had the option to interview me if they wanted to, but really importantly, to delete data. So I did a lot of video recording, and every time I had video recorded a child, I would play them a little extract of it afterwards just to sort of check that they were happy with it. And there was one occasion when a girl, I'd been videoing her doing some maths activities that she hadn't done very well in, and she looked a little bit subdued afterwards, and I asked her, did she want me to delete it? And actually the teaching assistant was trying to persuade her to let me keep it. But I could tell that she didn't want me to keep it, and so I deleted it, and that was no longer part of my data collection. For the adults, they all had the ability to review the transcript, and they could add or remove anything if they wanted to. I just felt this was common sense, because we all say things sometimes that we then regret and wish we hadn't said, or we all have conversations with people where afterwards we think, oh, I wish I'd said whatever. So it just seemed to me kind of natural that they could have that kind of flexibility. And in fact, they were also provided with the questions in advance as well, so they could have a think about it. Really, really important is consent and assent are not a one-stop shop. If somebody signs a consent form, or if somebody gives their assent, you don't assume that's it. It's not something you need to revisit. And particularly if you are with somebody on more than one occasion, as I was particularly with the children, you have to regularly check that they are happy to be taking part and to be with you and conducting whatever the data collection is at that point. And I believe that these processes can put participants at their ease. They trust the process and perhaps feel more confident to share. And this in turn can give you richer research findings. With the children, to go back to the issue that was raised at the ethics stage, I had a planned farewell. I gave each of them a book that was linked to their interests, and I felt this was a very sort of definitive way of saying that this would be my last visit, but also a kind of positive one in that I was giving them a gift. I produced a child-friendly version of the findings and also an accessible summary for the adults. And as I said, I believe that these approaches help me to have some quite rich findings. So always consider the power dynamics and make sure that you regularly check consent and assent. So to summarise some of these points. So disability research is a highly complex field with numerous debates and controversies. The different models of disability can help us to navigate and make sense of this complex field. These models in turn influence our overall methodological approach, for example by empowering your participants. If researching disability specifically, you must consider the implications at all stages of the research process. Sometimes more effort is needed to be inclusive of disabled participants, but it leads to richer research findings and greater research validity. It's undeniable that disabled people can be highly disadvantaged and that their rights are not always respected. Therefore, researchers should aim to empower the disabled participants through participatory methods. All researchers, however, should consider the inclusiveness of their research approach and methods. And it's important that everybody is familiar with, sensitive to, and respectful of debates about language. This is incredibly important. All researchers should see themselves as researchers in disability and engage with marginalised communities. As the World Health Organization wrote, disability is part of being human. And I've written there some selected references in case they're helpful. Thank you very much.